This is a case for the Christian God that you've never heard before, and I hope it shakes up your faith. Not just your faith in Christianity, but maybe even the faith in atheism or any other worldview that you may have. This is a very long-winded video, so I've separated everything into chapters just so you can skip around. However, I will warn you, you need the first chapter to understand everything I'm going to say after this, because it establishes a key principle that I reference constantly. And as you'll notice, I will check off to the side like this every now and again, probably pretty frequently, because I have notes off to the side. This is incredibly long, and as such, it's very difficult to memorize, but I'm going to do my best to stay attentive to the viewer. That being said, let's talk about the first concept that I want to introduce that I'll reference the rest of the time, that there is a natural polarity in the world. Light and dark, good and bad, yes and no, true and false, pleasure and pain. Every concept has an observable opposite, and in addition to that, every concept that has an opposite is the total absence and lack of that opposite. For example, yes is the absence of no, light is the absence of dark, and so forth. Duality is an inherent trait of reality. Something either is or isn't. Something is either correct or incorrect. For example, this square is either red or it's not. It's either a square or it's not. Down to the simplest nature of the world, things are binary, 0 or 1, yes or no, and this is undeniable. Now, this isn't limiting, but rather freeing, because it can give us a conceptual understanding of how the brain actually works. See, the human mind can't conceptualize anything past binality when it comes down to it. Even something now as intelligent as AI is rooted in binary code. We constantly make yes or no decisions as human beings 24/7. That being said, gray areas don't actually exist. For example, the answer maybe ends up being yes or no eventually. Everything that has definitive yes or no answers once they are fully observed, even quantum particles that can be two things at once called superposition, once observed end up being one way or another. For example, is this a triangle? No. Is it a square? Yes. Is it blue? No. Is it red? Yes. There will never be another answer to these questions that is not yes or no. So even in issues where people will brush them off as moral gray areas that depend on context are actually perfectly binary, because even context can be observed with yes or no questions. There are no exceptions to this rule. This paints a much bigger picture about our reality. Everything in this world seems extremely complex, but it's actually just an enormous collection of binary truths. But if you break every tiny trait down to its most fundamental level, you get 0 and 1. Even if something in our human nature is complex, as in our reactions to the same situation but in different contexts, or our emotions, can be represented in yeses and nos. Am I a nice guy? Yes. Am I a nice guy if you slap me across the face? No. Am I a nice guy if you treat me with respect? Yes. In most situations like that, I'm a nice guy. But if we take every situation in its context, we line it up, 0, 1, 0, 1, and so forth, it creates a pattern that visualizes my exact nature as a person, and these can change at any time if I develop or grow or my mindset shifts. But let me tell you why it must be binary. Let's say I need to go to the doctor's and the store, and you might argue that this can't be binary because I can choose to go to one, the other, both, or neither. That's a good argument, but let me tell you why it doesn't make sense. Using the fewest digits but still binary code, I can describe it like this. 0, 0, I go to neither. 1, 0, I go to just the doctor. 0, 1, I go to just the store. And 1, 1, I go to both. This is still binary. Or I could simply ask, did I do both? And then the answer is a simple yes or no. It's binary. If I don't do both, I have to specify what I do next, but even that deduction is binary. There can never be a 0.5 or a 2 or a 3 or any other number, because it's impossible for our traits and decisions to exist outside of yeses and nos at their most basic level. This light bulb is either on or off. Even if it's in the middle and it's dim, it's still on. We just have to ask a clarifying question. Is it also dim? And if the answer is yes, that is still binary. It is literally impossible for the human mind to conceptualize something that is truly non-binary. We operate on yes or no truth claims 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No matter how complex anything I've said in this video is thus far, it's still verifiable as either true or false. That means that if you disagree with my claim about the world being binary, you're actually helping my argument. I think I'm right, you think I'm wrong. It can either be one or the other. Just the fact that you have an opinion about this shows that I'm right. But maybe you can argue, well, not everything is binary. Some things have an infinite spectrum of options to choose from. Well, let's explore that argument. If you see this square, your brain says this is a square and it's red. So immediately you can either confirm or deny that this is a square and it is red. You don't say the square is not green, not blue, not purple, not yellow, not orange, and then once you get through all infinity colors in the spectrum, you then deduce that it's a red square. But even if you did, you're still acknowledging the fact that the square is not infinity other things to verify that it is this one thing, which is still binary, even if it's to an infinite degree of binaries. You can make one positive truth claim, the square is red, or you can make infinity negative truth claims, the square isn't blue, isn't yellow, isn't green, etc., until you get through all infinity colors. So even if you're presented with an infinite spectrum of outcomes and answers, it can still be simplified by a single verifiable truth claim. Even if the square was both red and blue, you can say the square is red and blue, and that is a single truth claim, which is binary. Or you can say the square isn't the infinity other colors that aren't the exact shades of red and blue. Up to you. That's still binary. This also applies to mathematics. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that is verifiably true. 2 plus 3 does not equal 4. That is verifiably false. It's either true or false. The equal sign is either true or false. However, this can be represented in multiple ways. I don't have to say 2 plus 2 is 4 and only that. I could say 3 plus 1 equals 4. And you may argue that that violates the binary nature because the truth can be represented in more than one way. However, the key word is represented. It cannot be interpreted a different way to be correct. For example, I can't say 3 plus 1 is 5. I can say 3 plus 1 is 4. There's only one truth, one answer to many representations. However, if somebody interprets the answer differently, they're not correct, implying one objective truth, whether or not it's represented in different ways. If you're still not convinced, this applies to even something as abstract as emotions. If you're feeling happy, you're feeling a mix of certain other emotions as well that ultimately add up and equate to what we call happiness. This means that there are some emotions you are feeling and some that you aren't. That's binary. Let's just simplify it and say that there is an infinite string of ones and zeros that confirm or deny the different emotions that you're feeling. And when that string is said and done, that will ultimately result in what we call happiness. Not this emotion, but that emotion. Not this emotion, but that emotion. An infinite number of times until we feel happiness. Just because binary systems can be extremely complicated or abstract, or even deal with infinity or human emotions, or both, it doesn't mean that they're any less binary at the most fundamental levels. Everything has observable, but sometimes infinite and very abstract levels of binary code, and as such, the inherent nature of truth within these systems is apparent. Once everything is said and done, regardless of how complex something's binary code might be, it still either is or isn't something. And I'm not saying it's literally code like a computer code, like we're living in the Matrix. I'm saying it's its composition, not the code. Things are composed of truths and non-truths, 0 and 1, which is also binary code. Once all infinity emotions are sorted out as either present or absent, you can say that they are happy or not happy. One truth claim to surmise and summarize an infinite amount of other truth claims. To simplify this entire thing, this means that observations about reality can either be objectively correct or objectively incorrect. There is nothing in between, and context, although it complicates it, doesn't affect the answer and the nature of the binality of the answer. But now let's get into the real exciting part: ethics. This applies to ethics as well. For example, Hitler was wrong, is wrong, and will always be wrong, regardless of social norms or what anyone tells us is correct. And you, unless you have flawed moral reasoning, agree with me. Now, how can I even make that claim? Even if Hitler thought he was right, that doesn't make him objectively right. Therefore, we can deduce that Hitler was deranged and had a warped perception of reality. If anyone denies Hitler being deranged, they are objectively incorrect. Something cannot be 0 and 1 at the same time, regardless of the person interpreting them. That's not the way the world works in any other facet. If one person thinks unprovoked violence is okay, and the other one thinks that it's wrong, they can't both possibly be right based on their beliefs. That contradicts the nature of everything else in the observable world. You can believe something is right, but it doesn't guarantee that it is. Just like colorblind people believe that this square is red doesn't mean that it actually is red. However, this is the fundamental belief that atheists possess, for example, because if there is no God, no natural lawmaker, how can there possibly be right and wrong? It is impossible for atheists to subscribe to the argument that there is objective good and bad, but it's actually easy to identify what is wrong and right. Let's bring my friend the red square back one more time. This square is red, not blue, not green, it's red. If you see it as not red, you're colorblind, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there is something inhibiting your ability to see reality clearly. Now let's apply that to ethics. Let's say I start beating up an innocent person in front of you. Am I wrong? Well, any normal person would not take so much joy in me beating up an innocent person and them being a bystander. But if somebody does take joy in that, that means they are mentally divergent in some way that is not normal. This also means that they have a condition that inhibits their ability to perceive the situation clearly, that what I'm doing to this person is wrong no matter what. See, regardless of your personal view, this situation can't go from 1, okay, to 0, not okay, just because of your subjective views. The only reason that your view on the obvious objective truth, like the color of this square, or the immorality of me beating up an innocent person, will only change contrary to the obvious truth if you have a condition that inhibits your ability to perceive reality clearly. You're not right about ethics just because you think you're right. Just like you're not right about this square just because you think you're right. Nobody is right just because they think they're right. If both you and I have different opinions on a moral issue, if both you and I see the square differently, one of us is right and the other is wrong. Additionally, if someone can only think something is contrary to the truth, if they have something that inhibits their ability to perceive reality clearly, that suggests that there is an objective truth that can be obscured by outside factors. Things like colorblindness or mental illness can lead us away from the truth, therefore implying that there is an objective truth about ethics and reality. You cannot claim morality is subjective to whoever's interpreting it and then claim that Hitler was deranged. But what? Of course he was deranged. It's provable. It's a yes or no answer, binary, and it is provable that he, yes, was deranged. He had narcissistic personality disorder. He was abused mentally and physically by his father. And because of those two things, he had no sense of empathy and had a superiority complex, and that explains his twisted objectives. If one admits that Hitler was deranged, which he was, that means the only explanation for you seeing him as wrong and him seeing himself as right is because that he cannot perceive reality clearly and you can. It's no coincidence that unless somebody has something inhibiting their sense of reality, there is something that is morally, objectively true, meaning one of you is correct about reality and the other isn't, thus implying an objective morality. This is just like colorblindness. If perception of color was subjective, that would mean that colorblindness wouldn't exist as a known condition, and a square could both be 100% red and 100% green at the same time, and both of us would be right. That notion is absurd and ludicrous. The same can be said for moral relativism. It's absurd and a ludicrous belief system. We know that something cannot be 0 and 1 simultaneously. That contradicts everything else in our known reality. One of us must be right and the other must be wrong. Thus is the inherent nature of our reality. There is a natural binary system in literally everything, including ethics, and our perception of objective truth is only obscured by ailments that aren't normal, like different mental conditions or colorblindness. Likewise, if morality was truly subjective, mental health disorders wouldn't exist either. And that doesn't make sense. They're observably true. A system where someone can only have a different opinion about morality if they're inhibited or deranged mentally in some way goes to show that there is an objective truth that people can be misled away from. Yes and no, right and wrong, it all boils down to the binary. Whew. So, what now? I'll have you know that my argument against moral relativism is not my crazy case of the Christian God. The truth is, we can use this inherent dualistic nature of reality, the objective binary nature of truth, to validate Jesus' claims about Christianity. And this can present a case for the Christian God that is incredibly strong. But let's talk about what we've established thus far. So far, we've established that at the most basic, tiny, fundamental level, reality behaves exclusively in binaries, including ethics. Heck, even biology agrees. We've only had male and female throughout the entire course of history for all living things. And although some species have variations of them, they're just that, variations, context, gray areas, so to speak. As we talked about, those don't exist. It can all still be boiled down to the binary. Reality has one truth, and there still cannot be two truths existing simultaneously. By extension, every concept has an observable opposite. Yes has no, light has dark, good has bad, and so forth. Anything in between these absolutes, or context, is just a situation that requires more observation that still results in more binary conclusions. These binaries also suggest that 1 is the total absence of 0, and likewise 0 is the total absence of 1. Dark is the absence of light. Bad is the absence of good. No is the absence of yes. They are opposites, and by extension, they're also inherently the absence of its opposite. 1 cannot exist if it shares any traits with 0, and the reverse is also true. For example, this light is off. It cannot show any observable signs of being on. Otherwise, it would be on. Therefore, 0 cannot share any traits with 1. Off cannot share any traits with on. This being said, there are lots of references in worldviews and holy text to the dualistic nature of the world. For example, in Christianity, light and dark, male and female, foolishness and wisdom, spirit and flesh. In the Quran, good and bad, light and dark, life and death, and wrong and right. Buddhist teachings speak of the juxtaposition of ignorance and enlightenment, attachment and detachment, compassion and indifference, and so forth. Hinduism does the same thing. So this speaks to a binary nature of reality where one concept is the complete and utter absence of its opposite. So duality is not just appreciated by Christianity, but by other major worldviews as well. And even without religion or any worldview, you can still logically deduce the dualistic nature of the world, as I did in the first chapter. Duality, however, is the one thing that most major worldviews agree on. And when so many things agree on it, it's very hard to deny it's not the case, especially when we just proved it. But now, let's focus in on the main issue: human choice. Or more specifically, human nature, are instinctual biological tendencies that exist outside of things we consciously choose to do. As human beings, and more notably living biological organisms, we have a certain nature wired into us. All creatures are wired to chase pleasure, like comfort, safety, reproduction, and good feelings, and avoid pain, hurt, negative emotions, discomfort, and death. This is what every organism's nature can be boiled down to. As human beings, we do the same. We chase pleasure. We're naturally wired to chase pleasure. And if it wasn't for our teachers and parents disciplining us, we wouldn't be able to do it any differently. Or would we? We'll talk about that later. We crave sex, approval from others, wealth, and often feel great pleasure in feeling proud of ourselves. These can be boiled down to lust, greed, materialism, and pride. However, everything in the flesh, everything physical, including our brains, are wired to chase pleasure and avoid pain, and we naturally gravitate towards these things. However, that presents two major questions, because we can choose against these things. However, if everything in the flesh, including our brain, is wired to chase pleasure and avoid pain, and we naturally gravitate towards these things, how do we know right from wrong? And even if we can know somehow without God, how do we have the capacity to act against our natural wiring? Well, we can obviously think things through to their conclusion and consider the consequences, even if it feels good in the moment. But even that is out of an instinctual nature to be self-preserving and our tendency to avoid pain. So even that is in our nature as thinking creatures. So how can we explain when we choose against our nature truly? But let's simplify it first. For example, let's call all natural aspects of human nature, our tendencies to chase pleasure and avoid pain, 0. So things like lust and overwhelming desire for sex, greed, laziness, resentment, theft, lying, anger, materialism, and gluttony are all 0. And their opposites we'll touch upon later. We'll label this human nature. Human nature is our 0 in binary code. Whenever we act according to these immediate impulses and emotions, we act in alignment with our human nature, with our fleshly desires. However, there is a key contradiction. In all of our experiences, we know that we can choose to act against any of these things, even if it means we have to suffer in order for others, even our enemies sometimes, to benefit if you're making the righteous choice. And I'm not saying it's impossible as thinking creatures to act against these impulses and emotions. I'm saying that the world's natural duality fits into all of this, and it's right in front of our faces. Whenever we choose the opposites to 0, human nature, we pick 1. And the 1s consist of all the opposites to the impulses of human nature. The opposite of lust, for example, is self-control, resentment, forgiveness, lying, truthfulness, theft, generosity, anger, compassion, materialism, contentment, greed, selflessness, gluttony, moderation, and sloth, action. If 0 is human nature, then 1 must be something too, right? Well, let's call it X for now. But flesh cannot contradict flesh. Human nature cannot contradict human nature. As discussed, aligning with X instead of human nature is the opposite of it. Just like 1 is the complete and total absence of 0, so X is the complete absence of human nature. So that means that you cannot act contradictory to human nature and still call it human nature. So X cannot be human nature. Just like something's opposite cannot have anything in common with itself, something cannot be its own opposite. Human nature cannot be both 0 and 1 at the same time, as it contradicts what we've already established about the binary nature of our reality. Your flesh cannot be 0 and 1 at the same time. It's either only 0 or only 1. So your flesh cannot logically or naturally act against itself. For example, how can a light be on and off at the same time? How can this square be 100% red and 100% blue at the same time? How can you steal and give at the same time? How can something be morally okay and not okay at the same time? How can something be finite and infinite at the same time? Notice all of these examples are paradoxical and impossible. They don't and will never make sense. But jumping back to human nature, like all these examples, human nature cannot contradict human nature. Human nature is an unmoving and unchanging part of our being as humans. It cannot ever change. You cannot be greedy and selfless at the same exact time, for example. And even if you are a selfless person, which is possible, you will still feel the impulse to keep things for yourself, naturally as a human being. If you're celibate as a human person, you will still feel the temptation to have sexual relations with somebody else. So that still exists regardless of your personality. You can either make a choice that goes with your human nature, 0, or against it, 1 or X. However, X cannot come from the flesh or our humanity because it is contradictory to it, which then violates the logical and provable natural laws about reality that we've already discussed. So, what is X? And this is where the trail goes cold. Through a lot of digging, we've established the world's undeniable duality, how that duality applies to morality, and then how this duality creates this mystery. What contradicts the flesh? What is the opposite of the flesh? Why can we choose against our flesh? Whatever contradicts our flesh must be something that is its opposite, something that is completely absent from it, just like 1 is the absence of 0. Something is the absence of nothing. Let's set it up using the same format of duality. Let's call the flesh 0. Some traits of the flesh include the fact that it is finite, meaning it won't live forever and will eventually die. It's physical, meaning you can observe and touch it, and it's weak, meaning it is subject to being hurt or controlled by outside factors. Whatever contradicts the flesh must possess the exact opposite traits. It must be infinite, meaning it never ends and never dies, non-physical, meaning it can't be touched or observed, and strong, meaning it cannot be hurt or controlled by any outside factors. And there's only one concept, one thing, that is infinite, non-physical, and strong that we possess. And that thing is conceptually called the spirit. So by using the duality of the world in which we live, we can establish that the thing that contradicts our fleshly desires and impulses cannot possibly or logically come from the flesh, where all of these problems stem from. The same thing that is the problem cannot be the solution. You can't call greed human nature and selflessness human nature. You cannot call lust human nature, but also call self-control human nature. The same thing that is the problem cannot be the solution. Rather, it is the antithesis to the flesh that allows us to act against it. That thing is our spirit, our true being unhindered by our flesh, something infinite, strong, and non-physical. But you may still not buy it. Maybe spirit is just a variable, or a concept, or a metaphor that is not supernatural. I get it. It's okay to be skeptical. Heck, it's right to be skeptical. Maybe it's just our higher conscience or our self, independent from our instincts. After all, we are the smartest creatures on Earth. I still haven't defined what X is yet, and it's time to do that. Stick with me here. I'm going to call the contradiction to flesh spirit, even if you don't agree that it's necessarily spirit or supernatural just yet. I'm just using it as a name. But let's figure out X. How can we go about finding what X is? How can we know about spiritual matters if they're unseen and untouchable? After all, we could just write down the list of human traits and their opposites, and then create a moral framework out of those opposites. But is there anything that claims to be that moral framework? Is there anything that claims to understand spirit already before you or I can go after maybe creating this framework for ourselves? Well, yes, and that's where different worldviews come into play. See, there are many different worldviews and religions that claim to know what's going on with the spiritual side of our reality. Additionally, there are so many questions when it comes to who dictates morality. So many things that claim to be X. For example, from a logical standpoint, we can tell that these impulses and desires are polar opposites of each other, but we don't know which side is right and which side is wrong. This is why we have to dig into the fundamental beliefs of the most popular worldviews to see if their claims have any validity. This is what any normal person should do if you're interested in finding out the truth about religion. So our goal is to find out, does anything say one column is absolutely wrong and one column is absolutely right? Does anything understand the nature of the spirit in the most precise way possible? Remember, since one column is human nature, and the other is the antithesis to that, the opposite choice, that means that if a major worldview condones any of the things in this column, it cannot be a trustworthy information source about the spirit, because it uses fleshly impulses to describe the nature of our spirits, which doesn't line up with our natural and provable binary system. Furthermore, one of these has to be morally correct, and the other has to be morally incorrect. We just don't know which one it is. So if a worldview condones anything in one column, but also condones something in the other column, that means they can't line up properly. And as we know, this is the complete absence of this. That means that if something of this is within this, that means that's not true, and that's not a correct worldview. To simplify that, if any teachings of the spiritual claim to be the truth, and then give teachings about the spirit that don't contradict the nature of the flesh, our human nature, they cannot possibly be true, as they violate the binary nature of reality. There are 5 major worldviews: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. There are actually so many things that claim to be this X variable. So many things that claim to be the answer, the antithesis and solution to our human nature. Let's go one by one and consider each major worldview. Remember, they're innocent until proven guilty, but it's also their job to back up the claims that they make, and our job to decide whether or not it's proof enough or not. First, let's talk about Islam. Allah, the God of Islam, claims to be absolute moral perfection. This means that Islam claims to be absolute truth. We can work with this. After all, having a complete understanding of the spirit means that you understand everything that contradicts human nature, and then you should call your followers to follow this higher spiritual calling. None of Allah's commands should align with human nature. Further, if he calls us to do certain things that are considered right in Islam, they should never ever also align with something else in the other column that's considered wrong. The problem is, there are 2 glaring things in Islam that are considered okay, and it's no coincidence that both of these commandments appeal to lust and pride. After all, these are the most dangerous of human temptations. It's our overwhelming urge to reproduce, which is by far our most prevalent and pressing natural behavior. And human nature tends to pervert that desire. Not to mention that the act of reproduction is euphoric and highly addictive. Additionally, our desire to glorify ourselves and feel great about whatever we're doing and to be above others is one that runs deep in humanity because it's our survival instinct. If we're above others, if we're better than others, if we agree with the herd, we're more likely to survive. But let's tackle lust first. Human beings are lustful and by extension, polygamous at our core. We desire lots of sexual options and the pleasure of sex with multiple different partners, instinctually. Scientific research more than enough backs this up. Even if you don't lean towards polygamy yourself, it is impossible not to feel attracted to, or in some cases lust or crave sexual relations with, more than one person in your entire lifetime. Every single person on earth is guilty of this. If Islam were to contradict our human nature and be the framework we move towards when we go against our nature, the Quran must warn against sexual promiscuity and polygamy. But it in fact does not. Instead, it appeals to our carnal desires for sex with multiple partners and says that it's okay. Surah chapter 4 verse 3 says that you can have up to 4 wives, and Surah chapter 4 verse 20 says that you can interchange them as you see fit and just. The fact that Islamic teaching aligns with our carnal and lustful desire to have sex with more than one partner, it cannot be the antithesis to human nature, meaning it's not the framework that we're looking for. Further, this is coercion and an appeal to our lustful desires as humans, and many choose Islam over other worldviews because of this. This was one of St. Thomas Aquinas' main arguments against Islam. The appeal to carnal desires makes it extremely unreliable. If I were a liar trying to get people to follow a false doctrine, the first thing I'd do to try to get people to follow me is not to appeal to what they need, but rather to appeal to what they want. Everyone loves to be told they're perfect just the way they are. Lust being the most powerful and overwhelming instinct in human nature is a perfect thing to cater to when trying to garner a following from lustful people, mainly men, because the law only applies to men. However, it's very clear that a worldview that caters to our fleshly desires is untrustworthy and doesn't contradict our human nature. Therefore, Islam cannot be truly spiritual, and Allah doesn't actually fully comprehend the nature of the spirit, and is rather something of the flesh, as it encourages and perpetuates our lustful desires. Once it goes along with the flesh, you know that Islam doesn't adhere to the binary principles that would help us be sure that this worldview is true. If Islam had a full understanding of the spirit, then it would have called us to either be monogamous or celibate, both of which contradict our human nature. But let's get one more example. Let's look at Surah chapter 3 verse 151. We shall cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, because they have associated others with Allah, that for which he had sent down no authority. And their refuge will be the fire, and wretched is the residence of the wrongdoers. This is a call to violence against non-believers that contradicts an earlier passage, Surah chapter 60 verse 8. Allah does not forbid you from those who do not fight you because of religion, and do not expel you from your homes, from being righteous towards them and acting justly towards them. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly. First, Allah calls Muslims to terrorize non-believers, then calls them to be righteous towards them. Surah chapter 9 verse 29 says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya willingly while they are humbled." And jizya, for those of you who don't know, is an extra tax imposed on non-believers in Islamic states that is intended to make them feel subdued and beneath the Muslims. In addition to that blatant contradiction, it also blatantly complements our human nature by telling Muslims it's okay to fight those who do not agree with them and terrorize them and make them feel lesser and subdued for not having the same belief. It complements our intolerant and exclusive instincts that are rooted in primal self-preservation. And by extension, it is not complementary to the nature of the spirit. This appeals to our pride and makes us feel like our ways are superior to others and allows us to put them down and be powerful because of our views. So the Quran allows its followers to satiate their carnal lustful desires and act upon human instinct to cast out, subdue, and shame anyone who doesn't agree with their beliefs. This lines up with human nature. And at this point, we can safely deduce that the Quran and Allah do not have a true grasp of the nature of the spirit. One more point. We don't know which column is wrong or right, and it's up to us to prove which one is wrong and right. However, Allah says that compassion is good instead of anger with non-believers to treat them justly. However, then he says that anger with them is okay and that you can lash out, subdue them, and terrorize them. And it says that compassion is not okay and that they should terrorize non-believers. So those things not only contradict, it also forces these two columns to overlap, which violates the binary nature of the world we proved earlier. Something cannot have any attributes of its opposite. Since one of these columns is morally okay, and one of them is morally not okay, we just don't know which, that means that if one thing is said as okay in a worldview and the other isn't, and then they overlap, that means that it's violating the nature of truth itself, which means it's wrong. Further, Surah chapter 2 verses 155 to 157 suggests that fleshly things are used as trials to overcome, like hunger, fear, and loss. However, when lust and pride are mentioned, they're actually told to satisfy these desires. So you can't say that things of the flesh are meant as trials and then tell us to satiate our flesh. That doesn't make any sense. It's contradictory. But let's move on. It's also not Buddhism. Dhammapada, verse 165. Do not go by what has been heard, nor by a tradition, nor by a rumor, nor by a scripture, nor by a reasoned conclusion. This text is essentially encouraging its readers to let personal experience dictate your perception of truth and reality. But Buddhism also has its own advice within its own text, and it's saying to not go by a scripture. So its scripture is saying to not listen to scripture, rather to let personal experience dictate what you do. Another one is a different text, Digha Nikaya 1. Do not go by mere tradition, by the authority of the scriptures, by mere reasoning, or by mere acceptance of a view. But Buddhism has views. Ultimately, the Buddha encourages people to use compassion, which is good, but judge each situation differently, as there are no moral absolutes and everything depends on context. Additionally, that means that in a Buddhist worldview, people can subscribe to other worldviews if that's what they feel called to and they feel is correct, and if it's what their experience points them to. If they experience that scripture correctly and positively, they should believe in it. That's what the Buddhist text calls for. But the problem is that other worldviews that they could subscribe to, for example, like Islam or Christianity, both have exclusive truth claims, meaning they're the only way to divinity, to the afterlife. So how can Buddhism say you can subscribe to other beliefs, but then once you experience those beliefs as true, they claim that Buddhism is false, and then you believe that? So Buddhism is basically a subjective worldview. Having no moral absolutes and a flexible viewpoint on accepting other worldviews that contradict each other's beliefs and teachings and moral code means that this worldview leaves it up to us, flawed human beings with human nature, to discern the moral implication of specific scenarios, which leans towards a non-binary, morally relative point of view that doesn't align with the binary nature of truth. But since Buddhism respects subjective experiences and it doesn't subscribe to moral absolutes, that means it's morally relative, which means it contradicts the binary nature of the world, meaning it's not the truth. This also means it's not Hinduism, though it's slightly different from Buddhism. A crash course in some of their basic beliefs is that Hinduism largely subscribes to the idea that each person has karma, which I'm sure you've heard before. Good actions with good intentions give you good karma. Any actions with bad intentions give you bad karma. Another belief of Hinduism is that everyone has their own dharma, or path in life, that differs from every other person on earth. That means that they're what's called a pluralistic religion, where there is not one specific path to salvation or enlightenment, including one that doesn't necessarily follow Hinduism's teachings. It even goes as far to say that non-believers in Hinduism, if they live good enough lives, can have good karma leading to their samsara, or their reincarnation. Hinduism does not claim to be correct in the same way that other major religions do. People that follow and subscribe to other worldviews are never seen as explicitly wrong in Hinduism, and rather are just seen as individuals with different paths. They believe that you can be saved through multiple paths, and that morality is not based upon absolutes, but rather the subjective experiences of the individual. It doesn't claim to be the absolute truth, rather it points readers to find their own dharma, or path, or truth. But if these point to Islam or Christianity, which means that Hinduism would be false in those paths. And if Hinduism leaves it up to personal experience and personal interpretation of your own path to make moral decisions, that means it's morally relative, meaning it contradicts the world's binary nature that truth is objective, not subjective, meaning it can't be true. The answer to this question of what is X is the answer you might expect me to present. It's Christianity. But let me explain. Firstly, Jesus claims to be the absolute truth, which is something that Buddhism and Hinduism don't do. John 14:6 says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Already we establish moral absolutes. God's character is unchanging, and therefore morality is steadfast and a reflection of God's character. At least that's what Jesus claims. The Ten Commandments, which probably everybody knows by now, is also a sense of a moral absolute. Right off the bat, to contradict Islam, Jesus teaches that marriage is meant to be monogamous. Matthew 19 verses 4-6 say, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." So already we contradict lust and polygamy with self-control and monogamy, which go against human nature. Matthew 5:28 says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Another contradiction to lust, saying that even looking lustfully is a sin. Let's see what else we can find within the New Testament. Matthew 5:22 says, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." This contradicts our human nature to be angry and resentful towards others who wrong us. Matthew 23:12 says, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." This contradicts our human nature to be prideful and self-absorbed, and wanting glory and attention. Luke 12:15 says, "And he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." This calls us against our human nature to base our value on physical possessions or social status, as our survival instincts would have us do. James 3:16 says, "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." This calls us against our human nature to desire or covet what other people have. John 9:4 calls us against laziness and to act. "As long as it is day, we must do the work of the one who sent me." And this verse is extremely important, because this calls us against our desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain, because we're called to leave comfort and follow God's commandments. And the most important part is that these commandments all call us to go against our flesh. What's interesting is that the Bible is a perfect interpretation of spirit, or at least our theoretical perception of spirit that we've already created. Jesus makes the claim that he is the truth and the only truth, and that he understands the spiritual truth of our existence. He even makes allegories and references to the fact that flesh and spirit are contradictory and total opposites, even citing some of the differences I cited earlier. John 6:63 says, "The spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the spirit and life." Flesh is finite and counts for nothing and will die, and the spirit, conversely, lives on. It's infinite, as we discussed earlier. Matthew 26:41 is a famous example. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." This plays into the flesh being weak, or influenceable by outside factors, and the spirit being strong, which is the exact opposite of weak. Romans chapter 8 verses 5-6 says, "Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires." This once again shows the direct opposite to flesh is spirit. It shows that if you desire fleshly things, you desire nothing of the Spirit. If you desire spiritual growth, you desire nothing of the flesh. It's either 0 or 1. Binary, and they can't be both at the same time. Jesus' understanding of the contradiction between flesh and spirit is one that is unmatched, unprecedented, and unrepeated in the entirety of human history. His calling against the flesh is one without holes, contradictions, and better yet, not one thing he commands his followers to do that complements our human nature or fleshly desires. Every aspect of human nature, of our impulses, is contradictory to what Jesus calls us to do, which makes sense, because while it seems like the world calls us to live for the flesh, Jesus calls us to live for the spirit, or the opposite to the flesh, and that also means doing everything that is contradictory to our flesh. Matthew 16:24 says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." It's even a key point that Jesus explicitly mentions that his followers must deny their human nature and desires in order to follow the calling of Christianity. Every single impulse of the flesh, Jesus calls us against without failure. Even Jesus' calling to love our neighbors as ourselves in Matthew 22:39 goes against our nature to be self-preserving and rather calls us to be selfless. Luke 6:28 says, "Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you." This calls us against our tendencies to seek revenge, vengeance, and harbor resentment for our enemies. A direct contradiction to verses in the Quran that call its followers to commit violence against non-believers and subdue those who think differently. Where the Quran fails, the Bible succeeds. There is not a single teaching of Jesus that complements human nature. Rather, everything Jesus teaches contradicts human nature and lines up with his words about dying to yourself and bearing the cross of suffering. In other words, denying yourself of your fleshly desires. Think about it. If anything Jesus called us to do was satisfactory to our carnal desires, to our flesh, then it would be an internal contradiction in the Gospels themselves, because Jesus cannot call us to deny our flesh and then give us commandments that satisfy the flesh. Jesus understood that spirit is the antithesis to the flesh. And so, this X variable is Jesus. Jesus is the antithesis to human nature. Every time we lean away from human nature and pick 1 instead of 0, we pick the opposite choice from what the flesh wants. We are actually aligning ourselves perfectly with Christian ideals, even if we don't know it every single time. So even if you don't believe the spirit or the supernatural spirit exists, well, we can just call it Jesus because he's a legitimate historical figure that claimed to know these things. So every time we do something that doesn't line up with the flesh, it does line up with Jesus. Whether you're an atheist or not, whether you're a Christian or not, it always consistently lines up. Every time you choose forgiveness instead of resentment, self-control instead of lust, generosity instead of greed, action instead of laziness, you're performing actions that are exactly what Jesus taught. No other worldview or philosophy comes close to the philosophical understanding of the nature of morality that Jesus taught, nor the extremely sophisticated understanding of the nature of the spirit Jesus taught. And it's not just a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. Every single trait of the flesh, of human nature, has an observable opposite, including the flesh itself, its opposite being spirit, or Jesus. The only reason we can make decisions contradictory to the flesh is because we have a spirit. The flesh cannot contradict itself. It's impossible in a binary system, which all things in the physical world are. Now this makes it extremely difficult to deny the spirit, or at least deny the validity of Jesus' teachings. Everything in the flesh category is contradicted by everything that Jesus taught, or the spirit category. He contradicts them to a precise T. And not just that, he was also prophesied 750 years in advance, and also 4 other times, to be the promised Messiah for humanity. That is mind-blowing that his teachings are this precise, and it was prophesied. Isaiah 7:14 is the prophecy I'm talking about. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." This prophesied Messiah comes to earth and not only claims to have a full, perfect understanding of the Spirit, but also tells us these teachings, and we can logically validate that every teaching he gives contradicts our human nature. Jesus says that instead of lust, have self-control, unlike the Quran. Instead of resentment, have forgiveness, unlike the Quran. Lying, truthfulness. Theft, generosity. Anger, compassion. Materialism, contentment. Greed, selflessness. Gluttony, moderation. And laziness or sloth, action. And the one thing that seals the deal is Galatians chapter 5, verse 17. "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and what the Spirit wants is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other." An observable, binary, natural law of reality, straight out of the Holy Bible. Nobody can understand human nature this well unless you created human beings. And more importantly, nobody can understand the spiritual truth that well unless you are of divine origin. The fact that the Bible calls direct attention to the fact of the duality of flesh and spirit, which reflects the universal objective truth that one thing cannot contradict itself, and it requires an opposite in order to do so. The fact that the Bible recognizes this, then Jesus' teachings and commands reflect this statement without flaw, unlike the Quran and other worldviews, shows that Christianity is the only worldview that legitimately understands the nature of the Spirit, therefore making it correct, and if not correct, then far more credible than the others. The Bible is the pre-existing framework that we theoretically talked about creating earlier. It provides the exact theoretical antithesis to human nature that proves it's divine by design. Jesus claims to be God, then gives us these perfect teachings that perfectly contradict the flesh without fail. Even if we were to write down all the aspects of human nature, there's no actual name for that framework. We've created the list, sure, but we haven't given it a name. We haven't called it anything. We haven't sought after what this actually envelops. And once you read the Bible, it's extremely clear that these ideals all line up with Jesus. It is objectively correct to say that we literally cannot escape biblical moral principles, because every time that we make a good choice, it aligns with the Bible. The Bible is what makes bad impulses bad and good decisions good. The Bible is our objective moral standpoint. God wrote the law on our hearts, and we all know this law, whether or not you believe it. Your God-given spirit is what allows you to work contradictory to your flesh. If you make a good choice that contradicts your human nature, one that avoids the fleshly desires and chases a higher calling, a spiritual calling, the absolute moral good, you're making a choice that directly aligns with the Bible, whether you know it or like it or not. But if you give in to your lust and marry multiple people and have sexual relations with multiple people you're married to, you're all good. The Quran condones it. If you hate those who disagree with you and you use that hatred to kill them, you're good because the Quran condones it. And in Buddhism and Hinduism, if you believe Islam is your path, all the more power to you. Morality is subjective, and it's up to your experience and interpretation in those worldviews, meaning it's impossible for them to be true. But if you do either of those things to gratify your flesh, the Bible, which teaches the truth and the right way to live, and teaches the truth about the Spirit, doesn't approve, which perfectly aligns with the binary nature of reality. My ultimate hypothesis is this: every time you make a good choice, an objectively good choice, it aligns with the Bible, which 100% proves that Jesus was who he said he was, God in the flesh. No other worldview fits this perfectly. No other worldview paints the true image of the Spirit in such a way that Jesus did. The Spirit, by binary natural law, must always be the opposite of the flesh, and that's exactly what the Bible describes without error, so it must be true. Even if you're an unbeliever and believe there is nothing in existence that is truly spiritual or supernatural, just the fact that you have the capacity to act against your flesh and that action aligns with biblical principles, which has a perfect understanding of the spiritual and claims to know of the spiritual, which also perfectly aligns with the inherent binary nature of reality, it still very much stands. God claims to be perfect, and as we can see, God is perfect, and Jesus lived a perfect life, free of sin. The flesh cannot contradict itself. You can't call greed human nature and generosity human nature. You can't call lust human nature and self-control human nature. It doesn't make any sense. A light cannot be on and off at the same time. We can't call our friend the square red and green because one of those things is wrong. You have a spirit. You know what is right and wrong. And the one worldview that has a flawless understanding of the Spirit and the Creator that made you in His image is Christianity. It cannot conceivably be anything else. Judaism and Christianity are very similar and teach the Ten Commandments. How can Judaism be wrong then? Good question. Jesus' divinity and credibility is also widely rejected by Jews. Deuteronomy chapter 17 verses 2 to 5 and Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 22 and 23 both condone killing people if they worship other gods or commit adultery. Not only does this contradict forgiveness as a core principle, it also condones killing somebody made in the image of God. So these are once again commandments in the Jewish faith that, like Islam, align with our instinctual and fleshly desire to want to ostracize or subdue anyone who doesn't agree with the herd. But the icing on the cake, in addition to these commandments, is the fact that Jews don't buy into Jesus. They believe that he was a liar and a false prophet. But is there any merit to this belief? Well, judging by what we've observed earlier, calling Jesus a fraud after the pure perfection in his teachings, and not just in my opinion, but rather by the fact that his teachings about the nature of the Spirit perfectly contradict the flesh, is a pretty insane claim. Claiming someone that perfect was simply a liar and a fraud is crazy, especially when if Jesus was a fraud, that would mean that he wasn't actually following his own teachings, which means he was doing everything just to glorify himself and gain a following. And not only a following, but he must have been so narcissistic that he wanted to have a following of 1 billion people even after he died. Not to mention a painful death that could have been avoided if he hadn't spread those lies that he was telling. Not to mention there are multiple eyewitness accounts, not just the least of which are the Gospels, which never contradict and only ever complement each other, including accounts about miracles only a divine being could pull off. Not to mention his birth from a virgin was literally prophesied 750 years in advance, and not just once but roughly 5 times, that detail exactly what Jesus was going to do, bear the role of leadership, and offer all of humanity true salvation. So with the perfect alignment of Jesus' teachings against human nature, the alignment of the eyewitnesses in the Gospels, and the foretelling of Jesus' coming and the obvious fulfillment of those prophecies once Jesus' work was finished, it becomes extremely difficult to believe Judaism over Christianity. Now, I am aware that Jews and Christians both use the Old Testament as a holy text. However, as Christians, we understand that those rules are outlawed and no longer permitted. It was God exacting his justice onto certain groups of people by using other people. So certain punishments were allowed back then. However, once Jesus died on the cross for us, he proclaimed that forgiveness must be issued, that redemption is always possible for any person as long as they turn to God and repent. So subscribing to those ideologies of the past where God would actively inflict punishment on people on earth directly is a thing of the past, and Jesus paid for those sins for us. So adhering to these principles in this current day and age, for example, the desire to stone somebody who blasphemes God or worships another god, is just an idea that is so foreign to us nowadays, and it's not morally correct. You can't just ostracize someone because they worship something different than you. Rather, we should love that person and try to turn them to Christ, but also never punish them for making that choice. That's up to God and God alone, and we should never take it into our own hands. Thus, it is a moral contradiction, and a contradiction to the spirit, to fulfill the fleshly desire to want to act out our angry impulses towards people who disagree with us. So, there you have it. The most long-winded case for Christianity that you've ever heard. Worked up from a point of pure logic using absolutely no Bible-based reasoning and using the way the natural world works as a binary system. Heck, I never even defined the impulses of human nature as right or wrong, because that would have been assuming an objective moral standpoint before getting to that place in the discussion. But by simply observing the duality of our reality, we're able to figure out that even if you don't believe in spirit, Jesus' teachings are the only ones in human history that, 1, claim to be absolute and the only truth, and 2, perfectly contradict every impulse and instinct that comes from fleshly human nature. And since the Bible and Jesus is literally the exact thing you gravitate towards when you choose to act against your own flesh, you have to intellectually and honestly acknowledge that Jesus Christ had a perfect understanding of not only human nature, but the nature of the unseen, the nature of the spirit. Meaning the chances that he's God are very, very high. So you've got to realize, whenever you make an objectively good choice, regardless of your worldview, that goes against your fleshly impulses and looks towards that greater, higher good, you're doing exactly what Jesus called us to do. God bless you.